In the 1960s, East Side High School in Paterson, New Jersey, was one of the best schools around. Joe was a popular teacher there because he taught important lessons with kindness and made learning fun through competitions. But one day, his class got interrupted by a fellow teacher named Frank, who told Joe there was a union executive board meeting happening without them. Joe, feeling angry, stormed into the meeting and shouted at everyone for not supporting his ideas for improving the school. He accused them of always backing down whenever the local government pressured them to stay quiet. Fed up with Joe's attitude, the board decided to transfer him to a different school. 20 years later, East Side High has completely changed. The school is now known as a cauldron of violence. The building looks run down, and the students don't respect anyone. Bullying, fighting, and violence are everywhere. They don't listen to the teachers and even attack them when they try to help. Drugs and weapons are traded like they're nothing. Most students can't pass the basic skills test, and this is a big problem for Mayor Boatman, who worries the state will take over the school, hurting his chances in the upcoming election. Frank, now the school's superintendent, and Mr. Rosenberg, the school board's lawyer, decide that the only solution is to bring Joe back. Mayor Boatman doesn't like the idea, but he agrees because he has no other options. Frank and Rosenberg go to Joe and offer him the job of principal at Eastside. At first, Joe refuses, knowing that the mayor only cares about saving his own political career and not the students. However, Frank convinces Joe by telling him that all his previous efforts, which earned him the nickname Crazy Joe, haven't made much of a difference, and he shouldn't let that be the story of his life. Joe eventually agrees and takes on the role. The next day, Joe arrives at Eastside as the new principal. He calls a meeting with the teachers and immediately asserts his authority, stating that he's the only one allowed to speak during his meetings. Joe asks for a list of all the students involved in criminal activities and instructs the custodian to clean the graffiti off the walls, with students in detention helping. He also demotes Mr. Darnell, the English teacher, to an assistant football coach. To tackle the violence, Joe orders that security guards be posted in the hallways. He tells the teachers they need to focus on preparing the students for the next standardized test, as the school needs at least 75% of the students to pass. Last time, less than 40% passed. Joe then holds a school assembly, where he gathers all the troublemakers on stage. While walking in, Joe meets Kenesha, a student who remembers him as her elementary school principal and is happy to see him. When Joe gets on stage, he asks for silence, but no one listens. Wow. The troublemakers laugh when he tells them to sing the school song. Realizing that these students won't change, Joe decides to expel them all. He tells the rest of the students that no one will bother them anymore, and warns them that they could be next if they don't start studying. As the troublemakers are escorted off the stage, the rest of the students calm down, especially after Joe's stern warning. Later that day, Joe meets with the parents. One of the mothers, Liana, is furious because her child was expelled, and many parents agree with her. But Joe stands his ground and gives a passionate speech about how a few bad students can ruin the entire school. He explains that he expelled 300 students to save 2,700 others, and he promised God that he would save this school. His speech wins over most of the parents, but Liana remains angry. The next day, Joe arrives at school and finds a student named Sams waiting for him. Sams had been expelled and tries to convince Joe that it was a mistake because he didn't do anything wrong. Joe, however, knows Sams is lying and takes him up to the roof. He calls Sams a coward for not telling his parents about the expulsion and warns him that drugs will eventually kill him. If Sams really wants to die, Joe says he should jump off the roof right now. Of course, Sams refuses and promises to do better. Joe gives him a second chance, but warns that if Sams messes up again, he'll be expelled for good. During lunchtime, Joe walks around the cafeteria, talking to students, listening to their concerns, and offering advice. Joe feels happy to see Ray dressed in a suit, setting a good example, unlike Sams and his friends, who are dressed sloppily. When Joe notices the boys bothering a girl, he calls them out in front of everyone, criticizing their clothing. He then makes them stand and sing the school song. Joe also reminds everyone that no one should move during the song. However, when Darnell bends over to pick up trash, Joe sends him to his office. Sams and his friends don't know the lyrics to the song, so Joe gives them detention. He also tells the entire group that from now on they must be ready to sing the song whenever asked, or there will be consequences. Afterward, Joe goes to the music teacher, Elliot, to inform her about the new rule. Elliot agrees to teach the song, but only after they're done preparing for an upcoming choir concert in New York. The students are practicing Mozart, and she insists their hard work be respected. She confronts Joe, saying he doesn't like when other adults stand up to him, which leads Joe to fire her and cancel the concert so the students can focus on the upcoming test. From now on, Mrs. Powers, the pianist, will oversee music class. Later, during a meeting with Darnell, Joe faces criticism again. Darnell feels like he's being treated like trash and wants Joe to remember that these are his students too. This leads to Darnell being suspended. Vice Principal Joan tries to reason with Joe, explaining that Darnell is more than just a coach and that nobody really understands Joe's methods. Joe responds that he prefers it that way. On the day of the practice test, students do their best while the teachers keep a close watch. Joe, impatient for the results, sends Joan to get the letter directly from the school board. One morning, a special presentation for the local press is interrupted by a cafeteria fight. An expelled student returns and attacks Ray, even pulling a knife. Joe quickly intervenes and wonders how the boy got in. Security tells him someone must have let him in from the inside. As a result, Joe decides that all school doors will be locked and chained from now on. A while later, Joe finds Kenesha upset. She's smart, but her grades have dropped since she lost her home after her mother abandoned her. Joe, determined to help, takes Joan to visit Kenesha's mother. The mother explains that she had Kenesha when she was a teenager, forcing her to give up her normal life and work. Now, she's trying to get clean, but it has taken a toll on her mentally. She thought Kenesha would would be better off with child services, though she never stopped loving her. Joe promises to help her find a better job and home if she agrees to take Kenisha back and help her focus on school. The news about the chained doors reaches the newspapers, and Leona uses this to file a complaint with the school board. Frank, a colleague, scolds Joe for acting irrationally and warns that Leona is organizing a group to get him fired, with the fire chief supporting her. He also criticizes Joe for alienating everyone like he did with his wife, and insists that Joe write an apology letter to Elliot and Darnell. If Joe wants to be respected, he needs to show respect to others in authority. Eventually, Darnell is reinstated, but more issues arise. The fire chief shows up at the school with the press, and Joe, in frustration, threatens him with a bat to make him leave. Joan tries to express her concerns, but Joe ignores her as usual. Joe is also disappointed when Ray comes to him, saying he's leaving the school because he can't stay there anymore. Later, Joe finds Sam's and his friends messing around in the bathroom. When Joe makes them sing the school song, he's surprised to hear a beautiful choir-like rendition. The boys admit Mrs. Powers taught them, so Joe visits her to congratulate her and ask her to teach everyone this version of the song. When the practice test results come in, Joe is upset to see that the students only scored 33%. He gathers all the teachers in the gym and blames them for the poor results, insisting they must work harder. Joe announces a tutoring program and extra remedial reading classes on Saturdays, but a teacher points out that it's difficult to make kids come on weekends. Joe plans to visit every student's home and talk to their parents, encouraging them to get involved and possibly attend the classes too if they don't know how to read. As the weeks pass, teachers and students work hard to prepare for the real test. Joe stays as involved as possible, but this still doesn't satisfy Leona. She teams up with the fire chief to speak directly with Boatman. Frank and Rosenberg try to defend Joe, but Boatman dismisses them and makes a deal with Leona. He will fire Joe, and she will rally support for Boatman's campaign. Later in the bathroom, Boatman talks to the fire chief, saying they'll arrest Joe for the illegal chains after the test. But he doesn't realize that Rosenberg is in one of the stalls and hears everything. Rosenberg quickly tells Frank, and they rush to warn Joe. Joe comes up with a plan. When the security guards see the fire chief arriving, they'll call code 10 on the walkie-talkies so the teachers can take the chains down temporarily. After this, Joan tries to talk to Joe about their reading program's progress, but Joe brushes her off, saying he's too busy and that the vice principal should handle things without always needing his input. At the end of the day, Joan confronts Joe and asks for a transfer. She tells him how frustrating it is to work with him, calling him an egotistical bully who pushes around people who can't fight back. She explains that half the staff feels the same, but they haven't left yet because they care about the students. Joan, however, is fed up with Joe's disrespect and lack of support for the teachers, so she wants to leave. The next day, before the school assembly, Joe hands Joan her transfer papers. Then, during the assembly, he gives a speech to the students about how the school has a bad reputation in the town and encourages them to prove they're better than that. He also thanks the teachers for their hard work, giving Joan special recognition for pushing him to do so. Next, Powers sings Lean on Me and the students join in, eager to show the government they're capable and not inferior. Seeing the students and teachers coming together, Joan decides to stay. On the day of the big test, the students begin their exams with confidence. However, there's also a school board meeting coming up, and Leona is tired of waiting. Boatman finally gives the fire chief permission to get a court order. Meanwhile, at school, Kenisha finds out she's pregnant, but her boyfriend doesn't believe he's the father, even though she insists he's the only one she's been with. Joe offers his support and promises to help her find some other options, but their conversation is interrupted when a guard announces the arrival of the fire chief with Leona and a group of reporters. Joe calls code 10 to have the chains removed, but the fire chief is ready and plays a recording of Joe's code 10, so Joe is arrested for violating the fire code, leaving Joan in charge. That night, the school board holds a meeting. Frank defends Joe's efforts, but Leona argues that the school only scored 33% on the practice test, suggesting Joe has failed in his mission. The meeting is interrupted when all the students show up, demanding Joe's release. Boatman realizes that firing Joe would look bad with this much support behind him, so he speaks with Joe, asking him to tell the students to go home. Joe refuses, so Boatman warns him that the police are preparing outside, and if the students riot, it could turn violent. Reluctantly, Joe agrees to speak to them, not because he believes they're wrong, but to keep them safe. When Joe comes out, Leona is already trying to talk to the students, but they only insult her and remind her of all the good Joe has done for the school. Joe is moved when he hears them calling him a father figure, but he's still worried about the police. He takes control of the situation and urges the students to respect the law. Suddenly, Joan interrupts with the test results, revealing the great news: the school has passed. Everyone celebrates, and Joe tells Boatman and the state that they can go to hell. Joe keeps his job, and the students end the night by singing the school song. When it's time for graduation, Joe personally hands out diplomas to the seniors, offering kind words tailored to each one.